David's eyes felt heavy as he focused on the seemingly endless stretch of asphalt in front of them. The glow of the headlights cut through the night, illuminating nothing but the dark, empty road and the thick fog that had started to creep in. Beside him, Megan leaned against the window, her head resting on her hand, watching the white lines disappear beneath the car with each passing second. "It's getting late," Megan muttered, barely lifting her eyes from the road. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" David glanced at her, forcing a smile. "I'm pretty sure. The GPS said it's the fastest route back, so we're fine." Megan shifted in her seat, glancing nervously at the fog swirling outside. "Yeah, but this road, it feels like we've been on it forever. I don't even remember getting on this highway." He chuckled softly, trying to lighten the mood. "Babe, we just missed the last turn, and I'm trying to get us back on track. We'll find an exit soon." Megan's fingers drummed against the armrest. "I don't remember seeing any signs for an exit." "You probably missed it while staring at your phone," David replied, nodding toward her dead phone lying between them. Megan picked it up, her eyes narrowing at the blank screen before sighing. "Maybe," she conceded, her voice tinged with doubt. "But it's weird, don't you think? No service for miles, and there haven't been any other cars." "Fog's probably messing with the reception," he said, shrugging. "And it's late. Not many people drive around this time." Megan didn't respond, but the feeling of unease settled into the pit of her stomach. She kept her eyes on the road, noticing how the fog seemed to cling to the car, thickening with every mile. The silence between them stretched, only broken by the faint hum of the engine and the rhythmic sound of the tires against the pavement. After a while, Megan sat up straighter, squinting at something in the distance. "Hey, did you see that?" David's grip tightened on the wheel. "See what?" "That sign we passed," she replied, her tone sharper now. It was completely blank, like someone scraped all the lettering off. David sighed. "I didn't notice anything like that." "Well, it was there," Megan insisted, her voice rising slightly. "And it's not just that. Something about this road feels wrong." David glanced at her, his expression softening. "Look, I get it. You're tired, and it's late. We'll find the next exit, get some gas, and figure out where we are, okay?" Megan bit her lip, nodding reluctantly. She tried to convince herself that he was right, but as the minutes ticked by, she couldn't shake the sensation that something wasn't adding up. The fog continued to thicken, wrapping around the car like a shroud, and the darkness outside felt suffocating. "David," she whispered, not daring to raise her voice above the hum of the engine. "How long have we been driving?" David glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It read 2:13 a man. He frowned, squinting at the numbers. "What?" Megan asked, noticing his change in expression. "The clock," he muttered, tapping it with his finger. "It's stuck." "Maybe it's broken," she suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Yeah," David replied, but his tone was distant, distracted. He tried to shake off the sense of unease growing in his chest. "It's probably just a glitch." Neither of them spoke for a while, the silence between them growing heavier. Megan kept her eyes on the road, searching for any sign of an exit or a gas station, anything to break up the monotonous stretch of highway. But all she saw was the fog, the empty road, and the occasional, barely visible road sign. "I don't like this," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. David didn't respond, his jaw clenched as he scanned the road ahead. He didn't want to admit it, but a nagging voice in the back of his mind was starting to agree with her. Minutes later, they passed another sign, and Megan felt her heart skip a beat. David. That was the same blank sign from earlier. "No way," he replied, shaking his head. "It couldn't be." "It was," she insisted, her voice trembling now. "I know it was." David kept his eyes on the road, refusing to look at her. "Megan, you're just tired." She didn't argue, but a chill ran down her spine. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the growing sense of dread that seemed to settle into the car like the fog outside. David kept driving, but in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that she might be right. As the fog thickened and the clock remained stuck at 2:30 in the phone, neither of them noticed the faint outline of a twisted guardrail in the distance. A guardrail they would pass again soon enough. The fog seemed to cling to the car, thickening like a wet blanket. Megan shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes scanning the road for anything recognizable. A landmark, a gas station, a rest area. But all she saw were the endless lines on the asphalt and the occasional roadside signs that came and went too quickly to read. David tightened his grip on the wheel, his knuckles turning white. He didn't want to admit it, but something about this drive felt wrong. He cleared his throat, trying to sound confident. Let's just keep going a bit longer, and if we don't find anything, we'll turn back. Megan stayed silent for a moment before responding. David, I'm telling you, we've already passed that same sign. 3 times now. David sighed, glancing at her before turning his attention back to the road. It's probably just a different sign that looks the same. They do that sometimes, copy the design. She shook her head, her voice growing more urgent. No, it's not just the signs. Everything feels like it's looping. The trees, the road, everything. David swallowed, trying to maintain his composure. Look, there's got to be a logical explanation. Maybe the fog is messing with our sense of direction. Maybe, she repeated, her tone sharpening. Or maybe we're lost and this road isn't going anywhere. The silence that followed was suffocating. David hated that he couldn't give her an answer. He hated that he didn't have a solution. He tried to ignore the nagging feeling in his gut that she was right, focusing instead on the road and the broken lines flashing by in a hypnotic rhythm. Then, from the corner of his eye, David noticed a sign up ahead, familiar, with rusted edges and faded paint. As they approached, his heart began to race. The sign came into view, its blank face standing tall beside the road. No lettering, no symbols, just a rusted frame and an empty surface. See? Megan's voice was tight with fear. That's the same sign. David clenched his jaw, not wanting to admit she was right. Okay, maybe there's a mistake with the road markers. It doesn't mean we're lost. Then why is there no one else here? Megan asked, her voice breaking slightly. We haven't seen a single other car, no trucks, no headlights, nothing. David didn't have an answer for that. The realization crept over him like the fog outside, heavy and suffocating. They had been driving for what felt like hours, and yet there was no sign of civilization, no passing vehicles, and no exits. As they continued down the road, the radio suddenly crackled to life, breaking the silence. Static hissed through the speakers, and both of them jumped, startled by the noise. David reached to turn the volume down, but before he could, a faint voice broke through the static. Distorted, like someone speaking from the other end of a long tunnel. Turn back. David froze, his hand hovering over the dial. He glanced at Megan, who was staring at the radio, her face pale. Did you hear that? She whispered. David nodded, his throat dry. He turned the volume all the way down, but the static continued to buzz faintly, almost like a whisper that never fully faded. What did it say? Megan asked, her voice barely audible. David didn't want to answer. He didn't want to acknowledge that they had both heard it. But the fear in her eyes demanded the truth. It said, "Turn back," he admitted. Megan's hand flew to her mouth, and she shook her head. We need to stop, David. We need to stop and figure out where we are. David wanted to argue, but the weight of her fear pressed down on him, and for the first time, he felt truly lost. Okay, he relented. We'll stop at the next place we see. They drove on in silence, eyes darting from the road to the mirrors, looking for any sign of a gas station, a rest area. Anything. But all they found was more road, more fog, and the same repeating landmarks. After what felt like hours, they saw another sign up ahead, this time with some lettering on it. Megan leaned forward, squinting to read it through the fog. "Wait, that's—" she began, but her words died in her throat as the sign passed by. David's blood ran cold as he read the words in bold letters. "Accident site ahead. Drive safely." The lettering was partially faded, barely visible through the grime. Megan's hands trembled in her lap. "David, what is this place?" David didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragments of their situation. But the more he tried, the more everything felt disconnected, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. The road stretched on, dark and empty, with no end in sight. And as they drove past the blank sign again, Megan felt a deep, gnawing dread in her chest, a sinking feeling that told her they were far from being okay. The fog continued to thicken, swirling like a living thing as the car pushed forward. Megan's hand was pressed against the door, her fingers tapping an anxious rhythm. David's eyes were locked on the road, his jaw tight with tension. They had passed the same rusted sign 3 more times, and the words on it, "Accident site ahead. Drive safely," now felt like a taunt rather than a warning. Megan couldn't take it anymore. "David, please stop. Just pull over." David's grip on the wheel tightened until his knuckles were bone white. "There's nowhere to stop, Meg. It's just road and fog. And turn around," she pleaded. "We can't keep going in circles like this." He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Okay," he said finally. "We'll turn around." David slowed the car and cautiously maneuvered into a U-turn. The road was narrow, but he managed to get the car facing the opposite direction. The moment he straightened out, a chill ran down his spine. It felt like they were driving into a dark void, the headlights cutting through an endless expanse of fog. As they drove back, the silence in the car was suffocating. Megan kept her eyes on the road ahead, scanning for anything that might break the monotony of the endless asphalt. But as the minutes ticked by, her dread only grew. Then, out of the fog, the familiar rusted sign appeared again. Megan's breath caught in her throat. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, this isn't possible." David's heart sank. He slowed the car to a stop and stared at the sign. The words were unmistakable. "Accident site ahead. Drive safely." It was the same sign, and yet it couldn't be. They had turned around. They should have been heading in the opposite direction. David's hands trembled as he gripped the wheel. "This doesn't make any sense." "We're not getting anywhere," Megan said, her voice trembling. "We're just driving in circles," David finished, his voice barely a whisper. He looked over at Megan, and the fear in her eyes mirrored his own. They were both struggling to understand, but the more they thought about it, the less sense it made. "Try turning again," Megan urged. "Maybe we missed something." David didn't know what else to do, so he nodded and slowly turned the car around once more. They drove in the direction they thought they came from, but the feeling of déjà vu was overwhelming. The fog seemed to thicken with every mile, wrapping around the car like a cocoon. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and every breath came with a sense of dread that they couldn't shake. Time seemed to blur, and the clock on the dashboard remained stuck at 2:13 a.m. David felt his sense of direction slipping away, and with it, his confidence. He kept glancing at the mirrors, half expecting to see something, or someone. Lurking in the fog? They passed the sign again. Megan's voice cracked as she spoke. "David, I'm scared." David swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to say something reassuring, to tell her it would be okay, but the words wouldn't come. His mind was too busy racing with questions and the growing fear that maybe they were trapped in something beyond their understanding. He glanced in the rearview mirror and caught a fleeting glimpse of something. A dark shape, just beyond the reach of the taillights. It was gone before he could focus on it, and he told himself it was just a trick of the fog. But his heart wouldn't stop pounding. "We need to stop," Megan said, her voice growing more frantic. "Please, David, we need to stop and figure this out." David hesitated, glancing at the dashboard. The fuel gauge showed they still had plenty of gas, but the idea of stopping in the middle of nowhere in this dense fog felt just as terrifying as continuing forward. "Okay," he said quietly, "but where?" Before Megan could respond, the radio crackled to life again, startling them both. The static was louder this time, more insistent, and through it, they heard that same disembodied voice. Clearer now, almost pleading. "Turn back," the voice said, its tone filled with urgency. "Turn back." David's pulse raced, and he instinctively reached to turn the volume down. But the voice continued, repeating its warning over and over. It was as if the radio wasn't responding to him anymore, as if something was forcing the message through. "What do we do?" Megan whispered, her voice barely audible over the static. David didn't answer. His mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what was happening. It felt like they were in some kind of nightmare, a dream where everything seemed real but nothing made sense. Then, without warning, the static cut out, and the car was plunged into silence once more. The sudden quiet was almost worse than the noise, and David felt the weight of it pressing down on him. "David," Megan said softly, her voice laced with terror. "Look." He followed her gaze, and his blood ran cold. Up ahead, barely visible through the fog, was a twisted section of guardrail. The same one they had seen earlier, crumpled and mangled as if something had hit it at high speed. David's hands trembled as he tightened his grip on the wheel. "This isn't real," he whispered, trying to convince himself as much as her. "It can't be real." But the truth was staring them in the face, and deep down, David knew that whatever was happening, it wasn't something they could just drive away from. As they approached the twisted guardrail, Megan reached out and grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his skin. "Please," she begged. "Please, just stop the car." David hesitated, glancing at the rearview mirror one last time. He didn't see anything unusual, just the empty road stretching out behind them, swallowed by the fog. But the feeling of being watched lingered, and he couldn't shake the sense that if they kept driving, they would only end up right back where they started. Taking a deep breath, David pulled the car over to the side of the road and cut the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, and the fog seemed to press in on them from all sides. "What now?" Megan whispered, her voice barely a breath. David didn't know. All he could do was stare at the twisted guardrail in the distance and wonder if there was any way out of this nightmare. The silence after the engine cut off felt unnaturally thick, as if the fog itself was absorbing every sound. David and Megan sat in the car, each lost in their own growing fears. Neither spoke for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the situation pressing down on them like the dense mist outside. David gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to steady his breathing. Megan's fingers trembled as she reached for her dead phone, staring at the blank screen as if willing it to turn on. She pressed the power button repeatedly, but nothing happened. "It's dead," she whispered, almost to herself. David let out a long, slow breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "Maybe we just need to wait for the fog to clear. There has to be something we're missing." Megan shook her head, her eyes darting nervously toward the rearview mirror. "It's like we're stuck here," she said, her voice barely audible, "like we're not supposed to leave." "Don't say that," David replied sharply, more out of fear than anger. He couldn't stand hearing his own thoughts spoken aloud. Megan bit her lip and turned to look out the window, her breath fogging up the glass. What if we're not lost? What if we're not supposed to find a way out? David's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Let's think rationally," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "We need to get out of the car and figure out where we are." She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "Out of the car? Are you crazy?" "Megan, staying here isn't going to help," David said, his voice firmer now. "We need to try something. Anything." She hesitated, glancing at the fog outside. It seemed to move, like swirling shadows that danced just beyond the reach of the headlights. She swallowed hard and nodded. "Okay, but let's stay close." David grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and opened the car door. The cold air hit him immediately, carrying a damp chill that seeped through his jacket. He switched on the flashlight and stepped out, the beam cutting through the fog in a narrow arc. Megan followed him, clutching her arms around herself as if trying to ward off the cold. The road was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the soft crunch of gravel under their feet. They walked a few steps away from the car, and David swung the flashlight in every direction, hoping to find something, anything, that would make sense. But all he saw was more road, fading into the fog. "David." Megan's voice was barely above a whisper. He turned to look at her, and she pointed toward the guardrail in the distance. It was twisted and mangled, like something had crashed into it with violent force. But there was something else, something beyond the guardrail, just barely visible through the swirling fog. A dark shape slumped against the side of the road. David felt a chill run down his spine. He raised the flashlight and aimed it at the shape, the beam cutting through the fog to reveal a car. An old, rusted car with shattered windows and a crumpled front bumper, its headlights dark and lifeless. "What the hell?" David muttered, his voice shaking. He took a step closer, but Megan grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "No," she said, her voice panicked. "We shouldn't go over there." David turned to look at her, confusion and fear etched on his face. "Why not? We need to see if there's someone in there." "No," she insisted, her grip tightening. "Something's not right. We shouldn't go near it." David hesitated, torn between wanting to check the wreck and the gnawing fear that she was right. The air around them felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the fog seemed to press in closer, as if trying to swallow them whole. Just then, the radio in their car crackled to life, blaring static through the open windows. Both of them jumped, turning to look at the vehicle. The static grew louder, more insistent, and then a voice, distorted and barely audible, began to speak. "Turn back." The voice whispered, each word stretched out and warping through the interference. "Turn back." Megan's eyes widened, and she shook her head frantically. "David, we need to get back in the car, now." David's hands were trembling as he nodded. They hurried back to the car, slamming the doors behind them. The radio continued to crackle with static, and the voice repeated its warning, over and over. "Turn back." David tried to turn off the radio, but the knob wouldn't respond. He twisted it back and forth, pressing every button, but the voice continued. He reached for the car keys, intending to restart the engine, but his fingers brushed against something cold and sticky on the dashboard. He looked down, and his breath caught in his throat. A thin trail of red liquid was seeping from a crack in the dashboard, spreading slowly across the surface. "David?" Megan's voice was barely a whisper. David didn't answer. He couldn't take his eyes off the red stain. It didn't make any sense. There was no way for something to be leaking from the dashboard. But the stain kept spreading, creeping toward his hand like a living thing. Megan reached over and grabbed his arm, shaking him. "David!" He snapped out of his trance and yanked the car keys, turning the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, and the radio abruptly went silent. The stain on the dashboard vanished, as if it had never been there. "Let's get out of here," David muttered, his voice shaky. Megan didn't argue. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at the rearview mirror as they drove away. The fog remained thick around them, and the darkness outside felt impenetrable. David kept driving, his hands trembling on the wheel. He didn't know what was happening, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That something was waiting for them in the fog. The road stretched on, seemingly endless, and the twisted guardrail disappeared into the mist behind them. But the uneasy feeling remained, lingering like a shadow in the corners of their minds. Neither of them noticed the sign as they passed it again. Accident site ahead. Drive safely. David drove in silence, his eyes darting from the road to the rearview mirror. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond their sight, hidden within the fog. Megan sat rigid in her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her breaths were shallow, and her gaze remained fixed on the road ahead. The headlights illuminated the narrow stretch of asphalt before them, but the fog made everything else appear hazy and distorted. Time seemed to lose all meaning, each minute stretching into an eternity. David felt like he was driving in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. As the fog thickened, David's grip on the wheel tightened. He tried to focus on driving, on finding something, anything, that would indicate they were getting closer to civilization. But there was nothing, only the endless road and the oppressive silence that seemed to press in on them. Megan broke the silence first, her voice barely more than a whisper. "David, what if we're not on the same road anymore?" "What do you mean?" he replied, his tone sharper than intended. "Maybe." She paused, struggling to find the words. "Maybe we're stuck, like we're not going anywhere because we're not supposed to." David's hands tightened around the wheel until his knuckles turned white. "That doesn't make any sense, Meg." "I know it doesn't," she replied, her voice trembling. "But nothing about this makes sense." David wanted to argue, to say something to calm her down, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he focused on the road, willing himself to keep driving. He glanced at the dashboard clock, still stuck at 2:13 a.m., and then shifted his gaze back to the rearview mirror. That's when he saw it. A fleeting glimpse of a dark shape in the fog, moving just beyond the reach of the taillights. It was there for only a moment, a vague silhouette, and then it vanished into the mist. David's heart began to race. He gripped the wheel tighter and pressed down on the accelerator, the car surging forward. Megan noticed the change in speed and turned to him, her eyes wide with fear. "What is it?" she asked. David swallowed hard, his voice barely steady. "Nothing. Just trying to get us out of here." She looked at him for a moment, her fear mirrored in his eyes. Then she turned back to the road, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat. The car continued down the highway, the fog swirling like a living thing outside. David kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the dark shape again. But it was gone, and he couldn't tell if that made him feel better or worse. They drove in silence for what felt like hours, but the road remained the same. Endless, monotonous, and devoid of any signs of life. The fog seemed to cling to the car, blocking out everything beyond the headlights. Then, out of the corner of his eye, David saw something up ahead, a familiar shape. His heart sank as they approached it, and he realized what it was. The rusted, twisted guardrail. Megan's breath caught in her throat, and she turned to look at him, her eyes filled with panic. "David, we're back where we started." David's pulse quickened, and he struggled to keep his voice steady. "No, it's just... David, stop lying to me," she shouted, her voice cracking. "We're driving in circles. I don't know what's happening." David yelled back, the frustration and fear boiling over. "I don't know what to do." Megan's eyes filled with tears, and she turned away, staring out the window. "We're never getting out of here," she whispered, more to herself than to him. David took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He couldn't let fear take over. Not now. He had to stay focused, had to figure out what was going on. But every part of him was screaming that something was terribly wrong, that they were trapped in a place they couldn't escape. As they passed the guardrail, David glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. For a moment, he thought he saw the dog's shape again, but it was gone before he could be sure. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog from his mind. "We need to keep going," he said, more to himself than to Megan. "We'll find a way out." Megan didn't respond. She just stared at the road, her face pale and drawn. The silence in the car felt heavy, almost suffocating. David's mind raced, trying to find a way to make sense of what was happening. But no matter how hard he tried, the pieces didn't fit. They drove on, the headlights cutting through the fog, the endless road stretching out before them. David's thoughts were a chaotic mess, a swirl of fear, confusion, and frustration. And in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone on this road. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the same endless stretch of dark asphalt cutting through a sea of fog. David and Megan sat in silence, their nerves fraying with every passing minute. The radio remained off, its unsettling static now replaced by an oppressive quiet that filled the car like a presence. Megan kept her eyes forward, her fingers gripping the edges of her seat. She wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything to break the tension, but she couldn't find the words. It was as if the fog had swallowed her voice, leaving her trapped in a suffocating silence. David stared straight ahead, his face pale and drawn. He felt like he was teetering on the edge of panic, but he couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. Not when they were so close to figuring out what was happening. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He didn't have any answers. Only a growing sense of dread that told him they were in a place they couldn't escape. The headlights swept across another sign, and David's stomach sank. He didn't even need to read it to know what it said, ... Accident site ahead. Drive safely. He clenched his jaw, refusing to acknowledge the sign. But Megan's quiet, trembling voice cut through the silence. "David, what if this isn't real?" "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely steady. "What if we never left the crash site?" She whispered, her eyes filling with tears. What if we died, and we're stuck here?" David felt a chill run down his spine. "That's not true, Megan," he said, trying to keep his voice firm. "We're not dead." "How do you know?" she shot back, her voice breaking. "How do you know we didn't die in that accident, and this is hell, or a limbo, or—" "Stop it," David snapped, his voice sharp and angry. He immediately regretted it when he saw the hurt in her eyes. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "Megan, we're not dead. We're just lost, that's all." She looked at him, her expression one of desperation and fear. "Then why can't we get out? Why is everything repeating?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But we'll figure it out. We just have to keep going." Megan didn't argue, but the look in her eyes told him she didn't believe him. She turned away, staring out the window, and David felt a deep sense of helplessness settle over him. He kept driving, the road stretching endlessly before them. The minutes felt like hours, and the oppressive silence made it hard to breathe. David tried to focus on finding an exit, on getting them out of this nightmare, but his thoughts kept circling back to Megan's words. What if they were dead? He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. But the idea had taken root, spreading like a poison through his mind. The signs, the twisted guardrail, the endless road. It all felt like a terrible dream they couldn't wake up from. As they drove, David started to notice something strange. The fog seemed to be shifting, almost as if it were alive. It moved in unnatural patterns, coiling and uncoiling like a living thing. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, but the fog remained unnervingly active. "What's happening?" Megan asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," David replied, his voice strained. He tightened his grip on the wheel, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to keep moving." But the more they drove, the more the fog seemed to close in on them. It was as if the road itself was changing, becoming narrower and more distorted with each passing mile. David felt like he was losing his grip on reality, the lines between the real and the unreal blurring with every turn of the wheel. Then, without warning, the car's engine sputtered and the headlights flickered. David's heart sank as the dashboard lights dimmed and the car began to slow. "No," he muttered, his voice filled with panic. He pressed down on the accelerator, but the car didn't respond. The engine wheezed and coughed, and then it died completely, plunging them into darkness. "David?" Megan's voice was trembling with fear. "What's happening?" "I don't know," he said, his voice barely steady. He tried to restart the engine, but it refused to turn over. The headlights flickered one last time before going dark, leaving them surrounded by nothing but fog and shadows. Megan's breaths came in short, panicked gasps. "We can't stay here," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to get out." David fumbled with the door handle, his fingers numb and clumsy. He managed to push the door open and stepped out into the cold, damp air. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling around him like a living thing. He felt a chill run down his spine, and every instinct told him to get back in the car, to close the door and lock it. But he couldn't leave Megan alone. He couldn't let her face this nightmare by herself. He reached out and took her hand, pulling her out of the car. They stood together in the darkness, their breaths visible in the cold air. The fog pressed in around them, and David felt a crushing sense of dread settle over him. "What now?" Megan whispered, her voice barely audible. David didn't have an answer. He felt like they were on the edge of something terrible, something they couldn't escape. But he couldn't let Megan see how scared he was. He had to stay strong for her, if not for himself. "Come on," he said quietly, squeezing her hand. "We need to keep moving." They took a few tentative steps away from the car, the gravel crunching under their feet. The fog seemed to shift around them, creating the illusion of movement in the shadows. David tried to ignore it, focusing on keeping Megan close. But then he heard it, a faint whisper carried on the breeze. "Turn back." David froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at Megan, and she looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. She had heard it too. The whisper came again, louder this time, and David felt a chill run down his spine. "Turn back," the voice repeated, its tone filled with urgency. David turned to face the fog, straining to see where the voice was coming from. But there was nothing, only darkness and shifting shadows. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the fog. It was barely visible, its outline shrouded in mist, but there was no mistaking the dark shape. David felt his blood run cold. He took a step back, pulling Megan with him. "We need to go," he said, his voice trembling. "Now." But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching them. David's heart pounded in his chest as he turned and ran, pulling Megan with him. They stumbled through the darkness, the fog swirling around them like a living thing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but David didn't look back. He couldn't. All he could do was run. David and Megan stumbled through the fog, their breaths ragged and panicked. The whispers seemed to follow them, growing louder with every step. David's heart pounded in his chest, and he tightened his grip on Megan's hand, refusing to let go. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and he felt like they were running in place, trapped in an endless loop. "David, stop!" Megan cried, pulling him to a halt. She was out of breath, her eyes wide with terror. "We can't keep running like this." David looked around, desperately searching for any sign of an exit. But the fog was thick and suffocating, and all he could see were vague, shifting shapes in the distance. The road, the trees, even the guardrail. They all seemed to blur together, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit. "What do we do?" Megan whispered, her voice trembling. David didn't have an answer. He felt like they were caught in a nightmare, and every instinct told him that there was no way out. But he couldn't let Megan give up. He had to find a way to keep them moving, to keep them from succumbing to the terror that threatened to swallow them whole. "Let's just—" he started, but his voice caught in his throat as he heard something. A distant sound, like tires skidding on asphalt and the crunch of metal. It was faint, almost like an echo, but it was unmistakable. "What was that?" Megan asked, her voice barely audible. David shook his head, trying to steady his breathing. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we need to figure out where it's coming from." They stood there for a moment, listening to the eerie silence that followed. The fog seemed to close in around them, and David felt a growing sense of dread, as if the air itself was pressing down on him. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the dark figure lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing, only mist and darkness. "We're not getting anywhere," Megan said quietly, her voice laced with desperation. "We're just going in circles." David opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He felt like he was losing his grip on reality, like the lines between what was real and what was imagined were blurring together. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but the fear gnawed at him, refusing to let go. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. A faint light flickering in the distance. "Megan, look," he said, pointing toward the light. "Maybe that's our way out." She turned to look, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the distant glow. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know," David admitted. "But we need to find out." They started walking toward the light, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The fog seemed to part as they moved, creating a narrow path that led them deeper into the darkness. David's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to keep going, refusing to let fear control him. As they got closer to the light, David felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if he had been here before. He couldn't explain it, but the feeling was overwhelming, and he couldn't shake the sense that something terrible was waiting for them at the end of the path. "Megan," he said quietly, his voice trembling, "do you remember the accident?" She looked at him, her expression one of confusion. "What accident?" David swallowed hard, his throat dry. "The accident we had earlier tonight. The one with the guardrail." Megan's eyes widened, and she shook her head frantically. No, that didn't happen. We're just lost." "We crashed," David insisted, his voice barely steady. "We hit the guardrail, and then, I don't remember anything after that." "Stop it," Megan pleaded, her voice breaking. "Don't say that." But David couldn't stop. The memories were coming back to him now, fragmented and disjointed, like pieces of a shattered mirror. The blinding headlights, the screech of tires, the deafening crash, and then darkness. He remembered the impact, the way the world seemed to spin out of control, and the terrible silence that followed. "We didn't survive, Megan," he said, his voice shaking. "We died in that crash." "No!" Megan cried, her voice filled with desperation. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "That's not true." "It is," David said quietly, the realization sinking in like a lead weight in his chest. "We've been driving in circles because we're not supposed to leave. We're stuck here, reliving the moment we died." Megan collapsed to her knees, her sobs echoing in the silence. David felt a deep sense of guilt and helplessness, knowing there was nothing he could do to change their fate. He knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her and holding her close. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, they stayed there, surrounded by darkness and fog. But then the light in the distance began to flicker, drawing their attention. David felt a strange pull, an instinctual need to move toward it, as if it held the answers to the questions that had haunted them since the moment they woke up on this endless road. "We have to go," he said quietly, helping Megan to her feet. "We need to see what's at the end of the path." Megan nodded, her face pale and tear-streaked. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes told David that she had come to the same realization he had. They were dead, trapped in a place that wasn't meant for the living, and the only way to find peace was to confront whatever was waiting for them in the light. They walked in silence, the light growing brighter with every step. David's heart pounded in his chest, and every instinct told him to turn back, to run away from whatever was waiting for them at the end of the road. But he forced himself to keep going, knowing that there was no other choice. As they reached the edge of the path, the fog began to clear, revealing a scene that made David's blood run cold. A car, crumpled and twisted, lay against the mangled guardrail. The headlights were still on, illuminating the wreckage in a ghostly glow. And inside the car, two figures sat motionless, their faces obscured by the shadows. David felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what he was looking at. The car, the guardrail, the two lifeless figures, it was all too familiar. It was their car. David stared at the wreckage, his mind reeling. The memories came flooding back, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. He and Megan had died in that crash, and now they were stuck in a loop, reliving the moment of their deaths over and over again. Megan covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with horror. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That's us." David didn't respond. He couldn't. He felt like he was caught in a nightmare, unable to wake up. He reached out, his hand shaking, and touched the cold metal of the wrecked car. The world seemed to shift around him, and he felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching himself from a distance. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and David knew that they were no longer alone. He turned to look behind him, but there was nothing, only fog and shadows. "Megan," he said quietly, his voice trembling, "we need to go." She nodded, her face pale and haunted. They took a few steps away from the wreckage, and as they did, the fog began to close in around them, swallowing the car and everything else in its cold embrace. The light flickered once more and then went out, leaving them in darkness. Darkness enveloped the road, and the fog seemed to thicken as if the air itself were a tangible thing. David and Megan stood together, staring at the spot where the wreckage had been swallowed by the mist. The oppressive silence seemed to press down on them, and for a long moment, neither of them could find the words to speak. David finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" Megan's eyes were red and swollen from crying, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "If we're dead, if this is all that's left, then what's the point of anything?" The weight of her words hung heavily in the air, and David struggled to find a response. He wanted to tell her that there was a way out, that they could escape this endless road, but deep down, he knew that wasn't true. They were trapped in a place where time had no meaning, and every step forward only brought them back to where they started. "We can't stay here," David said quietly, though even as he spoke the words, he wasn't sure what leaving meant anymore. He felt disconnected from reality, as if he were drifting between memories and the present moment, unable to grasp what was real. Megan wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. David didn't know, but he felt an urge to keep moving, to keep walking down the road even if it led nowhere. He reached for Megan's hand, and together they started walking. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, and with every step, the fog grew thicker, muffling their footsteps and distorting their surroundings. The whispers followed them, faint and distorted, like distant echoes carried on the wind. David couldn't make out what they were saying, but he felt a chill every time he heard them. It was as if the road itself were trying to communicate with them, trying to lead them somewhere, or keep them away. They walked for what felt like hours, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. David's thoughts were a chaotic swirl of fear, guilt, and confusion, and the more he tried to focus, the more everything seemed to blur together. He felt like he was walking in a dream, and every step only pulled him deeper into the darkness. "We're not getting anywhere," Megan said, her voice breaking the silence. She stopped walking and turned to look at him, her expression one of desperation. "We're just going in circles." David knew she was right. He could feel it. The road was an endless loop, and no matter how far they walked, they would always end up back where they started. But he couldn't bring himself to stop, couldn't bring himself to accept that this was all there was. "I don't know what else to do," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I don't know how to get us out of here." Megan's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "I can't keep doing this, David. I can't keep pretending that there's a way out." David felt a deep sense of guilt and helplessness. He wanted to comfort her, to find the right words to make her believe that there was hope, but he couldn't even convince himself. All he could do was keep walking, hoping that somehow they would find an exit, a way to escape the endless road. As they continued down the highway, the fog seemed to shift around them, creating the illusion of movement in the shadows. David felt like he was being watched, like there was something lurking just beyond the reach of the headlights. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the dark figure again, but there was nothing. Only mist and darkness. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something, a faint light in the distance. It was barely visible through the fog, but it was unmistakable. "Megan, look," he said, pointing toward the light. "Maybe that's our way out." She turned to look, her expression a mixture of fear and hope. "What if it's just another dead end?" "We have to try," David replied, his voice filled with determination. "We can't stay here." Megan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Together, they started walking toward the light, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The light grew brighter with every step, and David felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if he had been here before. He couldn't explain it, but the feeling was overwhelming, and he couldn't shake the sense that something was waiting for them at the end of the road. As they got closer to light, David realized that it wasn't coming from a building or a street lamp. It was coming from a car with its headlights on, parked on the side of the road. David's heart began to race as they approached the vehicle. It was the same car they had seen earlier, the same crumpled wreckage that had been swallowed by the fog. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, and he felt a wave of nausea wash over him. "This can't be real," Megan whispered, her voice trembling. "We left this behind." David didn't know what to say. He felt like he was trapped in a loop, reliving the same moments over and over again. The light from the car's headlights was blinding, and he had to shield his eyes as they got closer. And then he saw them. Two figures sitting inside the car, motionless and silent. David felt a chill run down his spine as he realized who they were. It was them. David and Megan stood there, staring at their own lifeless bodies, their minds reeling with the impossibility of what they were seeing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and David felt like the world was closing in around him. "We're not supposed to be here," Megan said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We're supposed to move on." David felt a deep sense of dread settle over him. He didn't want to accept it, didn't want to believe that they were stuck in a place between life and death. But he knew she was right. They were holding on to something that was already gone, and the only way to escape was to let go. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice shaking. Megan reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I am too," she said, her voice filled with sadness. "But we have to let go, David. We have to accept that we're gone." David looked at her, his heart breaking. He didn't want to lose her, didn't want to leave this world behind, but he knew that there was no other choice. They couldn't keep wandering the endless road, reliving the moment of their deaths over and over again. "We'll be together, right?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Megan nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Always." David took a deep breath, steeling himself for what came next. He turned to face the fog, the darkness closing in around them, and took a step forward. Megan followed, her hand tightly gripping his. As they walked into the mist, the whispers began to fade, and the light from the car's headlights dimmed. The road seemed to dissolve beneath their feet, and for a moment, David felt weightless, as if he were floating between two worlds. And then there was nothing, only darkness and silence.